I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you about this deck from Duskmourn Standard that uses Leyline of Resonance to win on turn 2, and there have been a lot of discussions about whether or not this card should be banned or if it's too powerful, and I'm not going to weigh in on those discussions, but the conversations did get me thinking about exactly how consistent the turn 2 kill is. But the problem with this question is that it's not super easy to solve. There are other combos in Magic that require a specific set of 2 or 3 cards, but this is not that. There is a lot of redundancy in this deck, but the redundant pieces are not exactly interchangeable. They all kind of play a little differently, and that kind of starts to make sense once you look at the cards. For one, the creatures we use to buff are not exactly the same. Cacophony Scamp has a death trigger that allows it to deal its power to your opponent, but it also has the ability to trigger that death trigger by itself by sacrificing itself after attacking. Heartfire Hero has the same death trigger, but it cannot trigger it itself. It needs a Callous Sellsword to do that. This allows you to sacrifice it and then deal damage to the opponent, which again would also trigger the death trigger. However, it does have a slight advantage, is that when you target it with the buff spell, it gets an additional +1/+1 for the first time in the turn. So it might get a little bigger than the Cacophony Scam. And if you're using a sword that's a strict upgrade because it's going to die anyway. And then you have the Monastery Swiftspear, which is typically weaker than the other two. There are more restrictive scenarios in which it can win, but it has haste, which means it can attack on the turn it comes down, which means it's super useful as the second creature you play, which sometimes you still will do and win on turn 2. So there are all of these different creatures. None of them are strictly better than each other. They all have their own niches to win. I will say that Cacophony Scamp is actually the best in terms of the statistics. It can win a lot by itself. And a lot of that comes down due to its death trigger and being able to trigger it itself. You don't necessarily need a sword. And we also have 4 different buff spells that we use in the deck, and each of them behaves a little differently. These are a little more simple because Turn Inside Out and Monstrous Raids are basically just strict upgrades and downgrades. Inside Out always gives +3/+0, and Monstrous Raids gives +2/+0, but occasionally gives +3/+1 if it doesn't already have a token attached to it. Dreadmaw Ire only gives +2, so that's a strict downgrade. And Felonious Rage also gives +2, but it also gives haste, which is again occasionally relevant considering these two creatures do not have haste. So Felonious Rage enables some turn 2 kills that we wouldn't have in the deck otherwise. Yeah, these cards on the right are great in the deck, but I'm strictly analyzing the turn 2 kill, so we're not going to look at those today. So yeah, I couldn't really figure out how to come up with a simple rule of thumb that could guarantee me deciding a win, so I ended up having to write some code to simulate battles to see exactly what the percentage is. So we can jump right into that now. Okay, before we get started, I just want to let you know that I will be leaving chapter markings on the time bar, so you can skip ahead to the conclusion if you don't care about the exact implementation details. But some of the results will make a little more sense if you stick around for the implementation. Yeah, so with a lot of things in computer science, the correct way to work through a problem is to break it down into smaller problems first. So that's what I did here. Instead of tackling the whole problem at once, I first looked at whether or not we could win on turn 2 based on what creature we have in play. So I wrote 3 functions to check what we could win with a Swiftspear, a Heartfire Hero, and a Scamp. And there are a couple of variables we need to look at. We need to look at how many ley lines we have in play, how many lands we have, and then the cards in our hand. I don't look at every card. For example, Heartfire Hero is never relevant on turn 2. So if we don't have a Heartfire Hero in play, it's not relevant however many more we have in hand. Yeah, and so you can see here that the function with Scamp is the most complicated. It can win in a lot of different ways. It doesn't even need 2 lands. It doesn't necessarily need a sword, as long as you can compensate in other areas. More ley lines, more buffs, etc. Sometimes it even wins by playing a Swiftspear out of hand. It gets pretty complicated. Whereas Swiftspear and Heartfire Hero have a little more of a restrictive situation. Heartfire Hero needs a swords to win no matter what, which also means it needs 2 lands because it needs to play at least 1 buff and then the burn together half of Sellsword. So yeah, and Swiftspear actually needs 2 ley lines in order to win, so that makes it a lot more restrictive. Yeah, it also needs 2 lands. So yeah, this Scamp seems to be the most powerful by far. Yeah, so then after that I take a step back and I return the appropriate function based on what creature we have in play. And then after that, we have our board state algorithm to win based on a given board state. We actually need to go back and simulate the actual game drawing cards, mulliganing, etc. So here is the class I use to keep track of individual cards, and then I write a function to create an entire deck, and I wrote a function to draw 8 cards. I draw 8 cards because we're also going to be drawing a card off the top on turn 2. And the functions later will keep into account that 8th card's a little different. We didn't have a chance to play it on turn 1. But here, I just return you 8 here for convenience. The only thing that's really interesting about this function is that Arena has a hand smoothing algorithm. I'll put a link in the description to describe that, but I basically mirror that hand smoothing algorithm here. So yeah, moving on. Here I wrote a function to determine if a hand could win without the 8th card in hand. This is really important because that 8th card that we draw off the top is not known to us on turn 1. So if we can make a decision about whether or not our hand can win without that knowledge, it'll be really helpful in our decision making, especially with mulliganing or which creature we want to play. For example, we can just loop through 3 times and, I guess imagine's kind of a strange word to use for a computer, but the computer imagines playing a Scamp first, imagines playing a Swiftspear first, and then imagine playing a Heartfire Hero. And if any of those situations win, then it returns that it can win because it'll just pick the situation that won, right? Same thing, if we were an intelligent player and we can look at our hand and know that we have a win in hand, we don't have to bother doing anything else. We can just move forward with that strategy. This function's a little more complicated because it takes our hand and also the 8th card off the top. It's simple to start. If the hand wins without the 8th card, then we just win, right? So we don't have to do any more thinking. But with thinking after that, it gets a little more complicated. Obviously, we can make a simple decision. If we don't have any lands or ley lines or creatures, then obviously we're not going to win, so we're going to return false. But the first complicated decision we need to make is if we have multiple creatures in hand, we have to decide which one to play. I'm pretty sure playing Scamp on turn 1 is almost always the way to go. So I did that first. That may not always be correct based on your hand, but I did that here. The more complicated decision, in my opinion, is whether or not to play a Swiftspear or Heartfire Hero. You need 2 ley lines for the Swiftspear, and you need a Swords always for the Heartfire Hero. The Swords also helps the Swiftspear, though. So there's probably some decision making to do here, but all I did is I checked if we had a sword, and if we had a sword, then we play the Heartfire Hero. Because we need that to win, and it can win in a few more situations the Swiftspear given the swords. Without the sword, the Swifty may be better, so I did that instead. Obviously, none of this comes into play if we don't have any of the other creatures in hand. This only comes up if we have more than one creature in hand. And also, we calculate our hand of 7 with every possible creature combination. This only comes into play when we can start having to consider the 8th card. So the damage that this imperfect algorithm does may not be gigantic. In whole, it might not be great. I'll show you later. I have a number where I know is an overestimate, so I know exactly how bad it isn't. It's a little better than the perfect case, certainly. Yeah, so now that we have this thing to check whether or not a hand will win, even with an 8th, we can go through our mulligan decisions. So the first strategy for mulligans is just to never mulligan. This is obviously the most simple, but obviously it's the worst. Sometimes you do want a mulligan. Based on, you have a bad hand, you might want a mulligan. So first, I'm going to scroll down a little bit to show you what a perfect mulligan would look like if you had perfect information of the world. So this mulligan algorithm takes every set of 6 cards in your hand and checks if it'll win with the additional 8th card you draw off the top. And if any of those win, then we win, right? We return true. So this is better than any human could do because it takes knowledge of the 8th card. But it's nice because it doesn't require any decision making. We can just brute force every possible situation and just decide on the best one based on perfect information. So there's no thought involved. So that was great for me. This was the easier thing to do. But obviously this is an overestimation. So I also wanted to get a more realistic number. So I created this mulliganing algorithm without perfect knowledge, but it's kind of dumb. Obviously, mulligan decisions are really complicated. Even like the best human players struggle with them sometimes. And I wasn't going to start doing that for this problem. I would be here for years probably. So I basically just ship back cards based on their value in my head. So obviously we ship back junk cards first, and then I ship back lands, and Dread Mazars is the worst buff. The good thing about this is we first check if any of our hands of 6 win by themselves. This is what I was saying. This algorithm's perfect if we don't have that 8th card, so we can use that information here to our advantage. But obviously there are a lot of 6-card hands that don't win, but could win if we drew the perfect card off the top. So obviously this is a little bit of an underestimation here, this kind of dumb mulliganing algorithm. But I'll show you exactly how bad it is in the future compared to the clairvoyant mulligan algorithm. Yeah, so now that we have our mulligan strategies, we can also mull down to 5, which is basically the same thing as mulling to 6, except we take hands of 5 instead of hands of 6. It's practically the same thing. Okay, so now we just run our trials. The numbers I'm going to show you are with 10 million trials each, so a total of 60 million trials. So I'm, pretty certain that it's very close to the real number. I, of course, was running a bunch of trials when I was testing the code, and the numbers never looked that different, even with 10,000 trials. So 10 million, I think, was a little overkill even. So I ran 6 trials, 3 each for smoothing and no smoothing. No mulligans, quote-unquote reasonable mulligans. It's a little dumb, but I mean reasonable in that a human can do better than that. And then I have the clairvoyant mulligans, which is mulligans that a human couldn't even beat. Oops, sorry. Okay, so the real number of, if you are an intelligent player playing this deck, is going to come somewhere between the reasonable number and the clairvoyant number. So we'll show to the results now, and you can kind of see what that looks like. Okay, so these are the results. As you might expect, hand smoothing improves your chances, and making more intelligent mulligan decisions also improves your chances. In Best of One Arena, the real number is somewhere between 16% and 22%. So that's actually a pretty scary number for me. The number could be as high as 20% for an intelligent player. I make some pretty bad decisions in the code when I'm not being clairvoyant. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a game designer or even a competitive Magic player, so I don't really know the context behind these numbers. But I can't imagine walking up to a game designer and telling them, hey guys, when you print this card, people are going to get wins around 20% of the time in Standard on turn 2. If they thought that would be a good idea, I can't imagine that. Yeah, this isn't even a particularly large Standard. We just recently had rotation, so God forbid they print anything that actually helps this deck. Yeah. I guess you guys can tell me in the comments if you think I'm missing anything, or you think this number is fine, or, if this card should be emergency banned. You share your opinions in the comments. If anyone, desperately needs the number, maybe I'll work a little harder on this, because the 16 number is too low, the 22 number is too high. Maybe I can narrow it down a little more. But otherwise, think I'm done with this. I think I've thought about this deck way more than the people who actually play it. So, otherwise, good luck surviving in the Standard environment.